I will not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them. This singular sentence, posted by President Donald Trump on Truth Social, has effectively frozen the logistics planning of the entire North American automotive industry. We are witnessing the beginning of a geopolitical standoff that threatens to sever the most critical trade artery between the United States and Canada within weeks. If you want to understand how this border crisis will impact your portfolio and the cost of daily goods, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. I am analyzing the raw trade data and the international legal contracts behind this dispute to give you the truth that the mainstream media misses completely. Hit that notification bell so you are alerted immediately when we release the urgent updates on this rapidly developing financial situation. Please leave a comment below telling me if you think the US government should seize half the bridge even if Canada paid for the construction. I want to know where the American public stands on this critical issue of asset sovereignty versus national economic interest in the modern era. The focal point of this conflict is the massive new 6-lane Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. It is a massive $6.4 billion infrastructure project that has been under construction since 2018 and is finally finished. It was designed to be the modern replacement for the aging Ambassador Bridge, which is currently the busiest commercial border crossing in North America. Roughly 25% of all trade between the United States and Canada flows across this specific 1-mile stretch of the Detroit River. That equates to over $300 million worth of goods crossing that border every single day of the year without interruption. The bridge is physically complete and was scheduled to open for traffic in just a few weeks' time in early 2026. But President Trump has thrown a wrench into the gears of global commerce with his latest demand for immediate American ownership. He is demanding that the United States government be given ownership of at least 1/2 of the bridge asset before a single car crosses. He argues that because the bridge connects to American soil and accesses the American market, we are entitled to a significant equity stake. The financial reality of this project is unique because the Gordie Howe Bridge was funded almost entirely by the Canadian government and taxpayers. Back in 2012, the state of Michigan refused to allocate funds for the project due to intense local political opposition and budget constraints, so Canada stepped up and agreed to pay for the construction of the entire bridge, including the massive U.S. port of entry facility. They also agreed to pay for the land acquisition on the Michigan side to clear the path for the highway connection to Interstate 75. In exchange for taking on all the financial risk, Canada was granted the right to collect all the toll revenue for several decades. This was the binding diplomatic deal that was signed and sealed by Governor Rick Snyder and the Harper administration many years ago. President Trump is now arguing that this deal was a bad deal for America, negotiated by weak leaders who did not put America first. He claims that the bridge was built with virtually no U.S. content, specifically citing the lack of American-made steel in the structure. He is using the leverage of the U.S. market access to force a renegotiation of a signed international treaty at the 11th hour. This is a classic Trump negotiation tactic where he creates an immediate crisis to force the other side to the table under duress. But the stakes here are infinitely higher than a typical trade dispute over dairy tariffs or softwood lumber pricing or aluminum quotas. We are talking about the physical infrastructure that keeps the American industrial heartland beating every single day of the week. The automotive industry in Michigan and Ohio operates on a strict just-in-time delivery system for parts that keeps the factories running. Car parts are manufactured in Ontario and shipped across the border to assembly plants in Detroit multiple times a day for immediate installation. A seat or an engine block crosses that river hours before it is installed into a finished Ford or GM truck on the line. There are no massive warehouses storing weeks of inventory because that inventory costs money to hold and takes up valuable space. If the Gordie Howe Bridge does not open and the Ambassador Bridge faces delays, the entire manufacturing system breaks down instantly. Auto industry experts estimate that Detroit assembly plants would run out of parts within 48 hours of a border blockade. This would force the immediate shutdown of production lines and the temporary layoff of thousands of highly paid U.S. auto workers. The economic damage would be measured in the billions of dollars per week for the U.S. economy alone, which is a massive risk. This is why the president's threat is being taken so seriously by the CEOs of the big three automakers in Detroit today. They know that they are the collateral damage in a much larger political fight between Washington and Ottawa over trade dominance. The timing of this threat is also highly calculated as it comes just before the scheduled grand opening ceremony of the project. Canada has already spent the money and built the asset and is ready to start collecting the tolls to pay off the debt. By blocking the opening, Trump is effectively holding the Canadian investment hostage until his demands for equity and concessions are met. He is betting that Prime Minister Mark Carney will blink first because Canada needs the bridge more than the U.S. does economically. The Canadian economy is far more dependent on exports to the U.S. than the U.S. is on imports from Canada, generally speaking. Roughly 75% of all Canadian exports go to the United States market every single year, which is a staggering dependency. If that flow of goods is constricted, the Canadian economy enters a severe recession almost immediately, and the currency will collapse. But Prime Minister Carney has taken a hard-line stance against what he calls American bullying and illegal protectionism of assets. He has stated that Canada will not cede ownership of an asset that was paid for by Canadian citizens to a foreign power. He is rallying his base by painting Trump as an aggressor who does not respect international law or binding agreements between allies. This political posturing on both sides makes a quick resolution to this conflict highly unlikely in the short term without major concessions. And while the politicians fight the business owners on the ground are left in a state of absolute panic and uncertainty. Logistics managers are frantically trying to find alternative routes for their shipments before the deadline, but options are extremely limited. But there is no real alternative to the Detroit-Windsor corridor for the volume of freight we are talking about moving daily. The Blue Water Bridge to the north is already at capacity and cannot handle the overflow traffic from the Detroit crossing. Rail capacity is also limited and cannot replace the flexibility of thousands of trucks moving just-in-time freight every hour. We are facing a supply chain bottleneck that could rival the disruptions we saw during the pandemic-era lockdowns. The difference this time is that the disruption is artificial and political rather than biological or viral in nature. It is a man-made crisis that could be solved with a signature, but is being prolonged for strategic leverage and power. The president also cited the fairness and respect that America deserves as a condition for opening the bridge to traffic. This vague language suggests that the bridge is just one piece of a larger negotiation package regarding North American trade. He brought up the issue of Canadian tariffs on U.S. dairy products, which has been a sore spot for American farmers. He also mentioned the refusal of some Canadian provinces to stock U.S. alcohol in their government-run stores as a trade barrier. It appears that Trump is using the bridge as a battering ram to break down Canada's protected industries and force compliance. He is saying that if you want access to our market via this bridge, you have to open your market to our milk. This transactional approach to diplomacy is the hallmark of the Trump doctrine in his second term regarding all foreign nations. He views every interaction as a zero-sum game where America must win and the other side must lose something. But in a complex integrated supply chain, it is possible for both sides to lose if the border closes completely. The inflation impact of this blockade would be felt by American consumers at the grocery store very quickly and painfully. Canada is a major supplier of fertilizer and food products to the United States market, specifically in the winter months. If those trucks are stuck at the border, the cost of farming in the Midwest goes up significantly and immediately. That cost is passed on to you in the form of higher prices for bread and meat and vegetables at the register. Construction materials like lumber and aluminum also flow south across that border in massive quantities to build American homes. A shortage of Canadian lumber would spike the cost of home building in the U.S., just as the housing market is recovering. This is the hidden tax of a trade war that is rarely discussed in the political rallies or campaign speeches. Tariffs and blockades are inflationary by definition because they restrict supply and increase transaction costs for every business involved. The Federal Reserve is watching the situation closely as they try to manage the inflation rate and keep it down. A supply shock from the north could undo months of progress on the inflation fight in a matter of weeks. But the president seems willing to accept that economic pain in exchange for a strategic victory over a trade partner. He believes that the long-term gain of owning the bridge outweighs the short-term cost of the disruption to the economy. He also knows that his base supports a tough stance against foreign nations, including our traditional allies like Canada. The narrative that everyone is ripping us off resonates deeply with voters in the industrial Midwest who have lost jobs. They see the closed factories and the lost jobs, and they want someone to fight for their interests aggressively. Trump is positioning himself as the defender of American sovereignty against Canadian freeloading on our market and economy. Even though the facts show that Canada paid for the bridge, the emotional argument is powerful and politically effective. Why should a foreign country own a bridge that lands in Detroit and connects to Interstate 75 on American soil? Why should the tolls collected from American drivers go to pay off Canadian government bonds instead of staying here? These are the questions that Trump is asking, and they are difficult for the globalists to answer without sounding weak. The concept of foreign ownership of critical infrastructure is becoming a major political flashpoint in the United States right now. We saw this with the port cranes and the TikTok ban, and now it is hitting the physical bridges. The era of borderless commerce and free trade is officially over, and the era of economic nationalism is here to stay. Investors need to understand that political risk is now the number one factor in any investment thesis today. You cannot just look at the cash flows and the balance sheet anymore, you have to look at the politics. A bridge with guaranteed toll revenue looks like a safe investment until the president blocks the entrance with concrete barriers. This applies to energy pipelines and power grids and telecommunications networks that cross international borders as well. Anything that crosses a border is now a geopolitical chess piece in a larger game of power and control. The Gordie Howe Bridge is the most visible example of this new reality, but it will not be the last one. We are seeing a reordering of the North American relationship that has stood for over 30 years of relative peace. The USMCA trade agreement is up for review, and this bridge fight is the opening salvo of that massive negotiation. Trump is signaling that the old rules no longer apply and that everything is up for renegotiation from scratch. For Canada, this is an existential threat to their economic model and their standard of living and their currency. For the United States, it is a flex of muscle to assert dominance over the continent's economy and trade flow. But muscle flexes can sometimes cause cramps, and this one could cramp the U.S. auto industry severely and painfully. The next few weeks will determine if this is just bluster or if the blockades are real and permanent. If the concrete barriers go up and the trucks stop moving, we will see immediate market chaos and sell-offs. The spot price of shipping and logistics will skyrocket as companies scramble for capacity that does not exist. Inventory shortages will hit the manufacturing sector, leading to earnings warnings from major companies across the board. The stock market has not fully priced in the risk of a total border shutdown yet, which is dangerous. Wall Street is assuming that cooler heads will prevail because the economic cost is too high for both sides. But they said the same thing about the tariffs in 2016, and they were wrong then too about Trump. Trump has proven that he's willing to use economic weapons even if they cause collateral damage to his own side. We are watching a high-stakes game of chicken played with 18-wheelers and billions of dollars of trade. The driver of the American truck is not swerving. He's pressing the gas pedal down to the floor. The impact on the currency markets is already starting to show the cracks in the dam of financial stability. The Canadian dollar is trading at multi-year lows as traders anticipate the economic hit to the Canadian economy. But the real currency crisis is just beginning, and it could get much worse very quickly for the loonie. We are about to see a currency war that is brewing beneath the surface of this bridge fight dispute. This conflict could cause the loonie to collapse, and that means massive changes for your purchasing power and investments. We also have to discuss the dangerous precedent of asset seizure and what it means for foreign investment generally. You do not want to miss the financial analysis coming up, because it affects your money directly and immediately. This is not just a story about a bridge, it is a story about the future of money and power. The immediate financial casualty of this bridge blockade is not the bridge itself, but the currency of our northern neighbor. Currency traders are currently shorting the Canadian dollar with a ferocity that we have not seen since the financial crisis. They understand that a nation that cannot export its goods to its primary customer is a nation that is effectively insolvent. The Canadian dollar, often called the loonie, is widely considered a petrocurrency that tracks the price of oil. But in reality, it is a trade dependency currency that tracks the health of the cross-border relationship with the United States. When that relationship breaks down, the fundamental value of the currency evaporates in the open market instantly. We are seeing projections from major banks that the loonie could fall to 60 cents against the US dollar within weeks. This would be a catastrophic devaluation that destroys the purchasing power of every single Canadian citizen overnight. It makes everything they import from the United States significantly more expensive, from iPhones to Florida oranges. This imports massive inflation into the Canadian economy, which forces their central bank to make impossible choices. They would have to raise interest rates aggressively to defend the currency, which would crush their housing market. The Canadian housing market is already one of the most leveraged bubbles in the world, and it cannot survive higher rates. So Prime Minister Carney is trapped between a currency collapse on one side and a housing collapse on the other. This leverage is exactly what President Trump is counting on to force a capitulation on the bridge ownership issue. He knows that Canada simply cannot afford to fight a prolonged economic war of attrition with the United States. But the destruction of the Canadian dollar is not necessarily a win for the American economy, either in the long run. A collapsed loonie makes Canadian exports to the US much cheaper, which hurts American manufacturers who compete with them. It also makes US exports to Canada too expensive, which kills the demand for American-made goods in our biggest export market. We sell more goods to Canada than we do to China and Japan and the United Kingdom combined every year. If our biggest customer goes broke because we destroyed their currency, our own factories will lose orders and cut jobs. This is the double-edged sword of a currency war that the economic nationalists often ignore in their rhetoric. You can crush your opponent, but you might get hit by the shrapnel of their collapsing economy in the process. The other major financial implication of this dispute is the terrifying precedent of asset seizure among allies. If the United States can effectively nationalize a foreign-owned asset because it connects to our soil, the rules have changed. This sends a chilling signal to every foreign investor who is currently building infrastructure in the United States today. Why would a German or Japanese company build a factory or a port terminal in America if it can be seized? The concept of sovereign risk is usually associated with unstable regimes in the developing world, not the United States. But by demanding 50% ownership of an asset we did not pay for, we are introducing sovereign risk to the US market. This could drive up the cost of capital for all future infrastructure projects, as investors demand a higher risk premium. We rely on foreign capital to fund our deficits and build our factories and buy our government treasury bonds. If that capital flees because they do not trust our property rights, the cost of borrowing for everyone goes up. The bond market is watching this bridge fight closely to see if the US is becoming hostile to foreign capital generally. There's also the very real risk of retaliation from the Canadian government, which has its own leverage points. While Canada is economically smaller, they control the energy tap that powers a significant portion of the Midwest. The Enbridge Line 5 pipeline runs through Michigan and supplies propane and oil to millions of American homes and businesses. If Trump blocks the bridge, Canada could theoretically restrict the flow of energy through that pipeline in response. This would cause an energy crisis in Michigan and Ohio that would spike heating bills and shut down refineries. It would be a tit-for-tat escalation that leaves citizens on both sides of the border freezing and broke. This scenario of mutually assured economic destruction is what diplomats usually try to avoid at all costs. But we are in a new era where economic weapons are being deployed with reckless abandon for political gain. The steel and aluminum industries are also directly in the crosshairs of this escalating conflict right now. President Trump specifically mentioned the lack of U.S. steel in the bridge as a reason for his hostility. This suggests that he is preparing to reimpose the Section 232 tariffs on Canadian metals that we saw in his first term. These tariffs impose a 25% tax on steel and a 10% tax on aluminum imported from Canada. While this protects the U.S. steel mills in Pennsylvania, it hurts every industry that consumes steel to make products. Ford and General Motors and Caterpillar would see their raw material costs jump instantly if these tariffs return. This makes American cars and machines more expensive globally, which makes them less competitive against Chinese rivals. It creates a situation where we save a few thousand steel jobs but lose tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs. The agricultural sector is another potential victim of the inevitable Canadian retaliation tariffs that would follow. In previous trade wars, Canada targeted U.S. dairy farmers and bourbon producers and ketchup manufacturers strategically. They choose products that are made in the home states of key political leaders to maximize the political pain. Farmers in Wisconsin and Iowa are already struggling with low commodity prices and high input costs today. Losing access to the Canadian market due to retaliatory tariffs could be the final nail in the coffin for many family farms. This is the collateral damage that is often glossed over when politicians talk about winning trade wars. The supply chain integration between the two countries is so deep that you cannot untangle it without pain. We share an electrical grid and a rail network and a pipeline system that ignores the political border. Trying to sever these ties with a blunt instrument like a bridge blockade causes chaos in unexpected places. We are already hearing reports of medical supply shortages in Detroit hospitals because of the logistics uncertainty. Many critical isotopes and pharmaceutical ingredients are manufactured in Canada and shipped daily to U.S. hospitals. If those shipments are delayed by border inspections or blockades, patient care is compromised immediately. This human cost is the most dangerous aspect of using a border crossing as a bargaining chip. The business community is currently mobilizing the largest lobbying effort in history to stop this blockade. Chambers of commerce from both sides of the border are flooding the White House with calls and letters. They are warning that a shutdown of the Detroit-Windsor corridor is an economic suicide pact for the region. But the president has shown that he is willing to ignore the corporate lobbyists if he thinks the voters are with him. He is betting that the visual of a strong leader standing up for America plays better than the complaints of CEOs. And he might be right politically, even if he is wrong economically about the consequences. The average voter sees a bridge connecting to America and thinks we should own it instinctively. They do not read the bond indentures or the treaty details regarding who paid for the concrete. This disconnect between the complex financial reality and the simple political narrative is the heart of the crisis. The financial markets are notoriously bad at pricing in political irrationality until it is too late. Traders assume that rational actors will find a compromise because money is at stake for everyone. But history is full of examples where nationalism and pride trumped economic logic and caused disasters. We are walking a tightrope between a renegotiation of a deal and a total collapse of a trade relationship. The uncertainty alone is enough to freeze investment decisions for months or even years to come. Why would you expand a factory in Michigan if you do not know if you can get parts from Ontario? Why would you invest in a Canadian startup if their access to the US market can be turned off by a tweet? This chilling effect on growth is invisible in the daily data, but it accumulates over time like rust. It slowly erodes the competitiveness of the North American trading bloc relative to Europe and Asia. While we fight with our closest ally, China is securing trade deals and building infrastructure across the global south. They are building bridges and ports and railways while we are blocking the ones we already have. This strategic blunder allows our true geopolitical rivals to gain ground while we squabble with our neighbors. The irony is that the Gordie Howe Bridge was intended to make North America more competitive globally. It was designed to speed up trade and lower costs and improve the resilience of our supply chain. Instead, it has become a symbol of the dysfunction and division that plagues our current political landscape. The bondholders who finance the Canadian portion of the project are also watching this situation with horror. If the U.S. seizes equity in the bridge, does that mean they are assuming a portion of the debt as well? Or is the president demanding a free equity carry where we get the profits but Canada keeps the debt? If it is the latter, it is essentially a default on the international obligations of the project entity. This would trigger lawsuits that would tie up the bridge in federal court for a decade or more. And while the lawyers argue in court, the bridge would sit empty and the concrete would slowly degrade. A $6 billion monument to political stubbornness, spanning the river but carrying no cars. This is the worst case scenario that everyone wants to avoid, but we are drifting towards it. The operational costs of the bridge continue to accrue, even if no toll revenue is coming in to pay them. Security and maintenance and insurance must be paid daily, regardless of whether the gates are open. These costs are currently being eaten by the Canadian taxpayer, who is getting nothing in return. This creates immense political pressure on Prime Minister Carney to retaliate to save face at home. He cannot be seen as paying for a bridge that the American president refuses to let him open. He will be forced to take drastic measures to impose costs on the U.S. economy to force a reopening. This escalation ladder is easy to climb, but very difficult to climb down from without losing face. Both leaders have staked their reputations on not backing down, which makes a compromise elusive. The currency markets are acting as the scorecard for this fight, and right now, Canada is losing badly. But if the retaliation hits the US energy sector or agriculture, the US dollar could feel the pain too. The localized inflation in the Midwest could spill over into the national data and spook the Fed. If the Fed has to hike rates to fight supply chain inflation, it crashes the US housing market recovery. So the contagion risks of this bridge fight are not limited to the currency or the auto industry. It flows through the veins of the entire economy via interest rates and inflation expectations. The smart money is hedging their exposure to anything that relies on cross-border efficiency. They are shorting the automakers and going long on volatility as the deadline approaches. We are witnessing a live experiment in what happens when politics collides with logistics head-on. The results of this experiment will determine the price of your car and your food for years to come. It is a reminder that in a connected world, there is no such thing as a local dispute anymore. Everything is connected, and when you break a link in Detroit, you feel the snap in Dallas. The most immediate and violent reaction to this bridge blockade is happening right now in the foreign exchange markets, where the Canadian dollar is being slaughtered. Currency traders are shorting the loonie with a ferocity we have not seen since the financial crisis, because they understand the math of trade dependency better than the politicians do. A nation that cannot export its goods to its primary customer is effectively insolvent, and the market is pricing in a catastrophic devaluation of the Canadian currency to 60 cents. This currency collapse is a double-edged sword that will decapitate the purchasing power of Canadian citizens while simultaneously destroying the profit margins of American exporters who sell to them. We sell more goods to Canada than we do to China and Japan combined. So if their currency becomes worthless, our factories lose their biggest customer overnight. This is the hidden danger of currency war that the economic nationalists ignore. You can crush your opponent, but you will get hit by the shrapnel of their collapsing economy in the process. But the financial contagion does not stop at the currency markets. It extends directly into the sovereign bond markets and the cost of borrowing for the United States government. By demanding 50% ownership of an asset, we did not pay for President Trump is introducing a terrified new variable called sovereign risk into the American investment landscape. If the United States can effectively nationalize a foreign-owned asset just because it connects to our soil, then the rule of law regarding property rights has fundamentally changed for every foreign investor. Why would a German automaker or a Japanese battery manufacturer build $1 billion factory in the United States if the president can seize equity in it on a whim? We rely on foreign capital to fund our massive federal deficits and to build our industrial base. And if that capital flees because of trust issues, our interest rates will skyrocket. The bond market is watching this bridge fight closely because it signals that the United States is becoming hostile to foreign capital even from our closest and oldest allies. This hostility forces foreign central banks to dump US Treasuries, which drives up yields and makes mortgages and car loans more expensive for every single American citizen. There is also the very real risk of the nuclear option retaliation from Canada, which involves the critical energy infrastructure that powers the American Midwest. While Canada is economically smaller, they control the energy tap that keeps the lights on and the homes warm in states like Michigan and Ohio and Wisconsin. The Enbridge Line 5 pipeline runs through Michigan and supplies the propane and crude oil that is essential for the daily survival of millions of American families. If Trump blocks the bridge, Canada could theoretically restrict the flow of energy through that pipeline in response, creating an immediate energy crisis in the Rust Belt. This would cause heating bills to triple in the middle of winter and force refineries in Toledo and Detroit to shut down due to a lack of crude oil feedstock. It would be a tit-for-tat escalation of economic warfare that leaves citizens on both sides of the border freezing in their homes and broke from energy inflation. This scenario of mutually assured economic destruction is what diplomats usually try to avoid at all costs. But we're in a new era where economic weapons are deployed recklessly. The agricultural sector is another massive victim in this conflict, as Canadian retaliatory tariffs would likely target US dairy farmers and corn growers with ruthless precision. In previous trade disputes, Canada has strategically targeted products from the home states of key political leaders to maximize the political pain and force a negotiation. Farmers in Wisconsin and Iowa are already struggling with low commodity prices and high input costs, and losing the Canadian market would be the final nail in the coffin. This is the collateral damage that is often glossed over when politicians talk about winning trade wars. The farmers and the factory workers are the ones who pay the price. The supply chain integration between the two countries is so deep that you cannot untangle it with a blunt instrument like a bridge blockade without causing chaos. We share an electrical grid and a rail network and a pipeline system that ignores the political border and relies on the free flow of goods to function. Trying to sever these ties causes unexpected failures like the medical supply shortages we are already seeing reported in Detroit hospitals this week. Many critical medical isotopes and pharmaceutical ingredients are manufactured in Canada and shipped daily to US hospitals for cancer treatments and surgeries. If those shipments are delayed by border inspections or blockades, patient care is compromised immediately and lives are put at risk for political leverage. The business community is mobilizing the largest lobbying effort in history to stop this blockade because they see the economic suicide pact for what it is. Chambers of commerce from both sides of the border are flooding the White House with warnings that a shutdown of the Detroit-Windsor corridor is a disaster. But the president has shown that he is willing to ignore the corporate lobbyists if he thinks the voters are with him, and the visual of a strong leader plays well. He's betting that the long-term gain of owning the bridge outweighs the short-term cost of the disruption. And he might be right politically, even if he is wrong economically. The average voter sees a bridge connecting to America and thinks we should own it instinctively without reading the bond indentures or the treaty details. This disconnect between the complex financial reality and the simple political narrative is the heart of the crisis, and it is driving us towards a cliff. The financial markets are notoriously bad at pricing in political irrationality until it is too late, and the damage is already done to the portfolio. Traders assume that rational actors will find a compromise because money is at stake, but history is full of examples where nationalism trumped logic. We are walking a tightrope between a renegotiation of a deal and a total collapse of a trade relationship that has stood for over 30 years of relative peace. The uncertainty alone is enough to freeze investment decisions for months or even years to come, as companies wait to see if the border is safe. Why would you expand a factory in Michigan if you do not know if you can get parts from Ontario or sell your goods to Toronto without a tariff? This chilling effect on growth is invisible in the daily data, but it accumulates over time, like rust, and erodes the competitiveness of the entire region. While we fight with our closest ally, China is securing trade deals and building infrastructure across the global south, and gaining market share daily. They are building bridges and ports and railways to connect the world to their economy, while we are blocking the bridges we already have. This strategic blunder allows our true geopolitical rivals to gain ground while we squabble with our neighbors over concrete and toll revenue. The irony is that the Gordie Howe Bridge was intended to make North America more competitive globally by speeding up trade and lowering logistics costs. Instead, it has become a symbol of the dysfunction and division that plagues our current political landscape and threatens our economic future. The bondholders who finance the Canadian portion of the project are also watching the situation with horror as the default risk rises every day. If the U.S. seizes equity in the bridge, it essentially triggers a default on the international obligations of the project entity and leads to a decade of lawsuits. And while the lawyers argue in federal court, the bridge would sit empty and the concrete would slowly degrade into a $6 billion monument to stubbornness. The operational costs of the bridge continue to accrue even if no toll revenue is coming in, which creates immense political pressure on Prime Minister Carney. He cannot be seen as paying for a bridge that the American president refuses to let him open, so he will be forced to take drastic retaliatory measures. This escalation ladder is easy to climb, but very difficult to climb down from without losing face, and both leaders have staked their reputations on winning. The currency markets are acting as the scorecard for this fight, and right now Canada is losing badly, but the US consumer will lose next. If the retaliation hits the U.S. energy sector or agriculture, the U.S. dollar could feel the pain as inflation spikes in the Midwest and spreads nationally. If the Federal Reserve has to hike rates to fight supply chain inflation, it crashes the U.S. housing market recovery and sends us into a recession. So the contagion risks of this bridge fight are not limited to the currency or the auto industry. They flow through the veins of the entire economy. The smart money is hedging their exposure to anything that relies on cross-border efficiency by shorting the automakers and going long on volatility. We are witnessing a live experiment in what happens when politics collides with logistics head-on, and the results will determine the price of your life. It is a reminder that in a connected world there is no such thing as a local dispute anymore because everything is connected and fragile. You need to prepare your own balance sheet for the higher prices and the economic volatility that is coming down the pipeline right now. Focus on owning assets that are inflation resistant and reducing your exposure to industries that depend on the free flow of goods across this border. The era of easy trade is over, and the era of economic conflict is here, and you must adapt your strategy to survive it. Thank you for watching this 3-part deep dive into the Gordie Howe Bridge crisis and the financial war that is brewing. We have covered the data and the risks and the geopolitical reality of this massive threat to your wallet. If you found this series valuable, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone you care about so they can prepare too. The algorithm suppresses this kind of truth, so we rely on you to spread the message to the people who need to hear it most. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the currency war, and if you think Canada will shut down the pipelines in retaliation. I will be reading your comments, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video with more urgent financial updates. Stay safe and keep stacking and never trust a politician with your financial future.